Adjustments in the light. I hope this quality of the light is good enough. Is it too dark, too bright? This is fine, right? Okay, because for me, the most important thing is that we see the images clearly. So sometimes in other contexts, we put the light very low, and then people complain that they cannot take notes. So just let us know what is comfortable. And likewise, if you cannot hear me for some reason, do let me know. And finally, yes, we do have that period for questions at the end, but if something is not clear in the course of the presentation, feel free to interrupt. I absolutely don't mind, so that's fine too. So today we'll be continuing the discussion of ways in which artists responded to World War I, and we'll talk about several artists who actually lost their lives in the war. But before I go there, I wanted to show you again something of more popular kind rather than high art. And in this case, it's postcards. Yesterday we talked about posters that were used for propaganda purposes by all of the different parties in the war. Today, I just wanted to show you these postcards because I found them when I was doing research about this series, and there are many, many more. But I chose just a few of them that highlight the ways in which people in general, we are not talking about artists, reflected upon the war, oftentimes with rather black humor, and oftentimes in ways that are utterly incomprehensible to us or to anybody sane. So this is a postcard which is American, business as usual, it says there, and there is the man in the trench, and then you can see an inscription there. It says, "New crosses and souvenirs bought and sold." So, new crosses and souvenirs bought and sold in the middle of the trench, business as usual. So I was fascinated to see that these postcards were being produced and that people were sending them to their families. And for example, okay, this is just a documentary, like a collage of various photographs. And that's another thing I wanted to mention, that what made World War I so different than many other wars before was obviously the incredible new machinery for killing on a mass scale, right, as we all know, but also this mode of documentation or capacity of people to document firsthand, various photographers, amateurs as well as professionals who were dispatched to document. And there was a whole group of, for instance, American artists who were sent together with the American soldiers, or British artists who were sent with the British armies to document what's happening in the trenches. And I will show you some of those images later on, but this is just one example from an album, actually, where you have images such as this heavily shelled trench, transporting the dead by rail. Everything becomes so clinical in these images. It's so objective and so clinical and so distant from human experience when you see it. And here is this American soldiers going over the top and dying. For the first time, on a mass scale, you could see photographs of people as they're getting killed. So many bodies being transported, people dead in trenches, corpses falling apart. This was unprecedented in world warfare. And then, of course, this is the Kaiser reviewing his troops, and then there are these drawings all around the album. Or here, for example, these are German postcards of the buildings that they destroyed in France, in Belgium, various medieval churches. And imagine a German soldier buying this and sending it to Germany as a document of what they have been doing. Incredible. So, yeah, this is the town hall, the Rathaus, and then behind it, the church. And then, for example, in this one, This is in Frankreich, in France, the cathedral, and the destruction of the town itself. And that they actually are interested in not only recording this, but using it as a card to their beloved. The worst one, which just I wanted to show you for a moment, is this one. I couldn't imagine that somebody actually wants to have this kind of photographic record of the war. So essentially this is the Western Front, and these are all of the fallen English people by our army. If you start looking for this, the Imperial War Museum in London is one of the best websites. It has fantastic repository of images and information about the Great War. So if you start looking, you will find a lot of this material now online. But I never knew it existed. I mean, to actually have all these dead bodies there with all these sticks pointing to where a body has been found. Unbelievable. So this is the kind of popular imagery. So what this tells you is that even the people who were not on the front lines, people back home, knew what was going on. So the trauma was overwhelming for everyone, not just for those who went to the trenches, but also those back home. And on that note, since I mentioned last time, I started a series of lectures with Dulce et Decorum est, I wanted to bring that poem today, just for a brief discussion. And this is actually a draft of a poem, and some of you will recognize it. Dulce est decorum est is the poem by Wilfred Owen, one of the best known poems by this poet, born in 1893, died in 1918. And he essentially composed all of his poems between August 1917, when he went to the front, and September of 1918. He was killed in November at age 25, just a week before the armistice. So, as you can read here, most of his writings were unpublished, or there were only 5 poems were published in his lifetime, 3 in The Nation, and 2 appeared anonymously in a journal he edited in 1917. When he was a patient in a war hospital. Yes, I forgot to say, he had been dispatched, then he was injured, then he goes back to the front, and he's killed in 1918. So he doesn't have a lot of illusions. We talked yesterday about some of the artists who continued to speak about the war as the great hygiene, including that unusual Frenchman in England, Henri Georgievska. But Wilfred Owen got extremely disenchanted with the whole project of this war. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of lines or stanzas from this poem, Dulce et Decorum est. Dulce et Decorum est is just the Latin phrase that is essentially the leitmotif of the poem. And the full phrase is Dulce et decorum est pro Patriamori, which essentially means it is so sweet and so decorous or appropriate to die for your country. And it's deeply ironic. And of course, he chooses a Latin phrase, Dulce et decorum est, because he wants to point out to the greatest of paradoxes in World War I, that so many very, very highly educated people could do this to one another. They were all well educated when they went there and behaved like beasts. So they all had Latin school behind them. So that's why he chooses a Latin phrase. Also, he chooses Latin because it was the lingua franca of all of the educated people throughout Europe. So no matter whether you were German or French or English or Italian, everybody could understand Dulce et Decorum. And the third reason he chooses that phrase as a leitmotif of the poem, even though I'm showing you lines from the poem at this point, is because there is something in that phrase, dulce et decorum est, where this draft begins. There is something in this phrase that harks back to ancient poetry, or specifically to a particular poet, Horace, who was a Roman poet, who was considered the father of poetic theory, so to speak. He wrote about what constitutes beautiful poetry, beautiful literature, and he spoke about a couple of criteria, including this notion of beauty or sweetness, dulce, and then decorum, meaning the whole notion of how everything has to be appropriate to the kind of topic you address. So it's incredibly ironic that he calls the poem dulce et decorum est pro Patriamori. So if you read the lines from this poem, you see that's actually from the same draft I showed you earlier. Bend double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed coughing like hags. We cursed through sludge till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. You can see what kind of words he uses, what kind of verbs. It's very crude, very base, very low language. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoods of gas shells dropping softly behind. He's trying to describe that horror, and he can only do it in this kind of matter-of-fact fashion, and then gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out, stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. And this is it. You see these people dropping all around you and you have to keep trudging along. And this is a kind of, it's something that you're probably familiar with from reading our other war poems, or whether it's from World War I or World War II or the Vietnam War. It's very, very similar, or any number of other wars we have had since and before. So it's an extreme, extreme disenchantment with the world and everything that civilization supposedly represented for these people. And there he goes on, and I will just focus on that last portion of the poem because it's a much longer composition. If in some smothering dreams you two could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, one of the dead, the man who just died next to him, and watch the white eyes rising in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood, this is the man who suffers from the gas poisoning. At every jolt the blood came gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro Patriamori. And he actually creates a rhyme at the end. The children ardent for desperate glory. So these are the kinds of poems that came out from the trenches, and in his case, most of them were published after his death. And of course, there were a couple of other people similar to Wilfred Owen. Here is another one, Harold Chapman, an American citizen who died for England at Luce on September 26, 1915. This is before America joined formally the war effort. And what's interesting is also this is posthumous publication. So somebody who wrote letters from the trenches, and he volunteered, like most of these other people we've been speaking about. He was a playwright, and these were first published, and that's actually the title of the whole publication, Soldier and Dramatist, being the letters of Harold Chapman. So published in 1917. But people knew, just as they could see the postcards, they could read these things that were coming out about the war. So just quickly, just a little bit of biographical information. That he had been born in New York, his mother had moved to London, he became engaged in theatrical scenes in London, and then of course he was very promising, very talented, but he decided to go voluntarily. And you can read here, one of his mother's old friends wrote a letter in which she said how noble it was of her son to fight for king and the country. And Harold laughed when he was shown the letter. I'm fighting for no king. And the best of this king is that he knows we are not fighting for him. He thought there was something fundamentally good about fighting that war, but not for the king per se. And yes, then a fellow soldier wrote a little note to his wife. You may possibly one day get an exact account from an actual eyewitness, but from what I can piece together, your husband went over the parapet to fetching some wounded man. He was certainly shot in the foot. It appears he persisted and was then killed outright by another shot through the head. He died trying to save a fellow soldier. And there were countless and countless and countless of these examples of heroic behavior, quietly heroic behavior, trying to help fellow men. But in addition to letters that he published, he also made drawings. And these accompany his letters and notes, and that's a photograph of Chapman in his military uniform. And this was intended for his wife and his mother, presumably. And he is explaining how they're equipped, what they're wearing. This is his mess tin, this is the water bottle, the long black thing around me is my waterproof vest. So he's explaining what the uniform looks like. And then these are some of the excerpts from the letter. And look at that second paragraph. Oh, my dear, to the wife, the men who have been buried out here, such splendid chaps, why do the best ones all get done in? I met a man, a friend, after their charge. 2 days after it, I had been hearing of this man and that one gone of those I had known best in the battalion, and I believe I shook hands with him for more than 5 minutes, which surprised nobody. The little ginger-headed chap whose hand gave me so much trouble at Hatfield was first to go in the charge of that battalion. A bomb finished him. Other patients and friends came back here with greater or lesser wounds, one with his breath whistling in and out of a hole between his shoulders. I saw him out delirious and comfortable with plenty of morphia in him. I can stick anything but depressed fracture of the skull. He was also a medic. He was helping. So he was trying to help his fellow men. And, you know, that's another thing I wanted to bring up when you read these descriptions of these terrible wounds that people suffered from and hardly any adequate medical assistance they could receive. I didn't want to bring in here, but I can just mention it. There is a whole museum in Berlin, little-known museum, which was created by a pacifist, by a German soldier who took part in World War I. And when he came back, he had photographs from the hospitals of everything he had seen there as a medic. And he created this incredible photo archive of wounded people with wounds the likes of which you don't want to look at. These photographs exist, and he created a museum dedicated to pacifism after World War I. Then the Nazis, normally when they came into power, closed it up. But it wasn't destroyed, the archive. And it has recently been reopened in Berlin. But it's not a very big, major institution, but it's something that you can seek out if you go there. But as I said, the photographs are such graphic representations of impossible wounds that I don't want to even show them. You can look it up, the Museum of Pacifism in Berlin. So yes, these are the kinds of records that we have from this war, through those postcards, through photographs, through letters of people, extremely immediate reporting about what's going on. And this is also from Chapman before his death, when he was creating this funny little caricatures, funny images of himself and his fellow soldiers. And you can see here, these are his friends. And there is me, right? This is the entrance. And this is supposed to be the way in which they sleep there in the trenches or in a tent, improvised. And then this is the way they go out, one at a time, as they're lost. And of course, what's interesting, the way he drew this in a very simplistic fashion, it resembles one of the archetypal symbols of the human predicament, which is the wheel of fortune. The wheel of fortune. Ever since the Middle Ages, you have representations of the wheel. And as the wheel turns, whoever is up, whoever is down, whoever goes in, whoever goes out. It's entirely a matter of chance and accident. And that's another thing that's very remarkable, that these people realize when they're deployed, when they go there, how accidental and nonsensical it all is. Which is why when we look at some of the art that was created as a form of protest against the war, so many of the artists also spoke about absurdity. So, just one other person I wanted to bring in, who also is not major name in history of art, but he was a poet as well as a painter, Isaac Rosenberg. So he was by background Jewish, grew up in London. He was opposed to the war and wrote against it, but then went in 1915 because he needed the money, not for patriotic reasons. And he also was killed at age 27. And this is a very, very nice self-portrait from 1914. So before he goes to the trenches, from the National Portrait Gallery. And you can see that he was very much in line with the avant-garde movements of the time period. It's a realistic portrait, but it's also informed by this new interest in more open brush strokes, more expressive handling. And he was quite talented, as you can tell from this self-portrait. And then this is a poem that he wrote from the trenches. But as you can tell, he was killed in the last few months of the war when he was 27. So the darkness crumbles away. It's the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaps my hand, a queer sardonic rat, as I pull my parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Because the rat goes from soldier to soldier, doesn't know who belongs to which party. Now you have touched this English hand. You will do the same to a German soon, no doubt. It will be your pleasure to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chanced than you for life, bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in your eyes? At the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens. What quaver, what heart aghast? Poppies whose roots are in men's veins drop and are ever dropping. But mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with dust. For the moment, a little poppy behind his ear. So he's talking about living with these rats, living for months at a time in those subhuman conditions, and making this kind of sardonic joke about how the rat makes friends everywhere he goes, crossing from English to German and back. And poppies, and of course that incredible symbol of the poppies and the blood, and the fragility of the flower that remains with us from the Great War. So, and then of course, you have French people, so everybody, I mean, this is kind of universal, very cosmopolitan in that respect. This man is much better known as a writer, at least in the French context of the avant-garde. He was actually Polish/French. His mother was French, and his name is very, very long, but he is best known as Guillaume Apollinaire, also born 1918. He dies at the end of the war. He was injured in 1916, but he died actually of that pandemic of the influenza at the end of World War I that swept throughout Europe. So he was extremely well known among artists. He championed all kinds of avant-garde artists, including Picasso and Braque, and he also wrote about this whole new movement that he actually coined a name for this art movement in France, Orphism, art that is inspired by the notion of Orphic poetry, ancient poetry, all about color, all about life, vitality. So he was sort of portrayed by fellow artists, and here is Giorgio De Chirico, a famous Italian painter who becomes one of the first surrealists before surrealism. So this is a portrait of Guillaume Apollinaire from 1914. Obviously, this is, he says, premonition portrait of Apollinaire from 1914, where he shows him here with the dark glasses, and you might wonder for yourself, why is this like an ancient statue that wears these black eyeglasses on top? Because the blindness that De Chirico is talking about, Apollinaire's blindness supposedly, signifies that whole business that in order to understand the world really well, you have to close your eyes to the world. In other words, that maybe there is more insight in the so-called blindness than in looking openly. And also the blindness at this point in 1914, and it's interesting, this is painted on the eve of World War I, is this whole idea of if you close your eyes and do not see what is in front of you, you may be able to contemplate what is going to happen. So it's like premonition, it's like foretelling, it's like this business of seeing into the future. The other final point I want to make is that the painting is obviously making reference to antiquity, and since Apollinaire had written about this Orphic poetry that goes back to the ancient poet Orpheus, the idea here is that Apollinaire is making a bridge through this portrait, bridge between antiquity and the future. But in order to make that bridge, you have to kind of close your eyes to the present. So people are very much preoccupied with these questions. What is to happen? Where is our culture going? How do we go from that antiquity into that unknown future? What will happen there? So these are the preoccupations that they share. And of course, here is just another illustration of how present Apollinaire was. This is actually painting by another artist from the time period, Andrey Rousseau, 1909, who was interested in naive painting. And by naive, I mean painting that appears to be absolutely non-academic, unlearned, like somebody who never went to art school, and he actually didn't. And Apollinaire is here portrayed, but this is muse inspiring the poet, and this is an idealized portrait of Apollinaire again. And these are just a couple of images I wanted to show you by Apollinaire, the man who died. This concrete poetry. Calligram is the term that he invented for these poems, and you can see they're called Poems of War and Peace, 1913-1916. And some of them were written before the war, and some of them were written after he had experienced the warfare. And it's quite interesting that, like many other poets at this time period, he's playing with letters and their values. We already spoke about graphic representation of letters a little bit briefly yesterday with the posters. You will see that again and again around 1915, 1920. Everybody is interested in how words change their meaning depending on how they're shaped and how they're placed on a page. And this may sound like a little bit of an irrelevant issue, but let me just explain for a minute why they were so obsessed with that. In the Western languages, unlike Asian languages, the form of the letter doesn't impact its meaning. Red is red regardless of whether you write it with small letters, big letters, whichever font you choose. But we all know, especially in this day and age of fonts, that depending on how big your font is, or whether you choose blue for your email message, bold, italic, it has a different emotional impact. We are all aware of that. So at this point, artists and writers began saying, hold on one second, words are words, but words get very important poetic inflection, or they become emotionally more powerful when you start playing with them and creating all kinds of visual configurations. So actually, Apollinaire invented this whole notion of calligram, or words that create forms. In this case, almost like a plant growing. This is an eye that's being formed. This is some kind of chalice or a cup that's being formed. And this kind of word-image play becomes very interesting for a number of people, whether you're talking about Russians, French, Germans. You will see it also with the Dada movement. It is important not just because of the emotional aspect of the words and letters, but also because they want to point to this notion of nonsense. Words in the Western tradition always signify that you know what you're talking about. There are clear thoughts and clear words. When words are no longer clear, that means the thoughts are no longer clear. Ideas get mixed up. Concepts get mixed up. We live in a world in which we cannot differentiate one from the other. So they're trying to address this business of confusion that's happening around them. And that's something that everywhere in Europe, they're writing these strange, concrete poems. And there is one big movement towards concrete poetry around 1915, 1920. And then in the 1960s, this resurfaces again as a fashion, concrete poetry. So these are some of his poems of war and peace from 1917. And he actually is also interested in cinema, in phonographs, all of these things. And he actually writes that it would be strange during an epoch when the absolutely most popular art form, cinema, is a picture book, if the poets didn't try to create images for the thoughtful and more sophisticated souls who will not be content with the filmmaker's clumsy imagination. This is his words. The movies will get more sophisticated. One can foresee the day when the phonograph and the cinema will be the only recording techniques in use, and poets may revel in a liberty hitherto unknown. So they were also trying to fight with this new media, and they were trying to revitalize language in the age of the moving image. And that's another thing I wanted to mention, that film, in addition to photography, because they could film and document what was happening on the front, also becomes a powerful tool for communication. So finally, this is just a little image of Apollinaire by Picasso when he has his head tied up, and that's Apollinaire when he comes back from the trench wounded, and that's his grave in Paris in Montmartre Cemetery. And he was deeply, deeply mourned by everybody in the avant-garde Paris community because he had been such a significant art critic. So now I want to move just a little bit to a couple of Germans who also were deployed or volunteered for the war and were very, very quickly killed. August Mack, another very young, very talented artist, 1887. August Mack started out as somebody, you could say, influenced by post-impressionism and this kind of bolder colors, starting from realism, but already you can see that nice deep red behind, and you will see how he dramatically changes within the next few years. So I'm bringing in here a couple of quotations from Mack. And I just want you to read them to understand why he paints the way he paints. Most of his works were painted by 1914, then he gets deployed and killed. So, incomprehensible ideas express themselves in comprehensible forms. What he's trying to do is not to talk about, I see this beautiful vista in front of me, I want to record it. But I want to talk about this whole set of emotions that are provoked by what we see, how we respond to the world. And it creates ideas that we cannot comprehend. We cannot comprehend, and we try to find some forms to express them. And then he also says that form is a mystery to us, for it is the expression of mysterious powers. Everybody is into mysticism at this moment, and mysteries. And the supernatural, not supernatural, but maybe it's better to already use the term subconscious, what is underneath. Most of these artists around 1905, 1906 are already aware of this idea that there is more to us than our rational selves. Whether via Freud, he begins to publish, or it is just in the air, as they say. There were other people aside from Freud who were writing about the subconscious, the universal, what connects us all. So when you look at these artists, just remember that most of them, when they depart from realism, they do it in order to tap into something larger, symbolic, more mysterious, unknown. And this is what he says also. Our senses, our sensory experience is the bridge between the incomprehensible and the comprehensible. In other words, it's a bridge, it may not be sufficient, but we will try to go from that world of the incomprehensible to something that you can recognize, comprehend. So very, very high-level ideas, maybe not systematic philosophy, but these people took art seriously. They took it as a matter of life or death. This was important to them. And then Mack was also he was a friend of another very important German artist at this time, Franz Marc. Yes, who called him Monsieur de Couleur, because Mack was very interested in bright colors. You will see some of those paintings. This is as he moves towards that kind of more colorful palette. So he also gets very much involved with this group that some of you may be familiar with, Blau Reiter. Vasily Kandinsky was one of the first painters or founders of the Blau Reiter, the Blue Horseman, the Blue Rider, and Alexei von Yavlensky. Those are the best-known artists of this group around 1906 to 1910. In Munich and other German cities, they even published a magazine. I'll talk about that briefly later on. They were way too mystical. And Franz Marc, for example, his friend, had an entire system where there were abstract values and significances to color. But Mack used them primarily as expressive vehicles for feelings and emotions. He's mystical in a sense that he is interested in the bridge between the incomprehensible and comprehensible, as he said earlier, but some of the other artists in Blau Reiter group had an entire system which color signifies what as a symbol, and they created this alternative spirituality through color. This is a portrait of his wife with his self-portrait, both of them from about 1909. So you can see how there is, on the one hand, something very realistic, on the other hand, very vivid, expressive, trying to get to some deeper emotions through these blues and yellows and reds. And progressively, by 1911, 1912, his pictures become ever less real, and they become more abstract. Everybody, of course, in Europe is trying to develop abstraction at this moment, but if you ever wondered, what was it that drove so many artists around 1908, 1910 towards these primary colors, towards this rather vivid rendering of reality, towards this anti-naturalism, these oblique perspectives, this twisting and turning of forms. What was it? It was this, what we call symbolist attitude, that the world is not just about I depict what I see, but I depict what I see and what I feel, and I try to express those feelings. And the more vivid and expressive the colors, the stronger the expression of those internal emotions or impact. And this is how he simplifies. I wanted to show you the realistic images versus the more symbolist or expressionist images, because he could draw very well, but he purposefully goes towards this very simple language. Lady in green jacket. He went briefly together with Paul Klee, the much better known artist, to Algiers, and these are some of the wonderful images that he painted there. This is another one, 1914. Beautiful, simple, abstract, bright colors. It probably reminds you of some of the art created here. I mean, I've been looking at some of the art created in South Africa by African artists, and I can see that there is a lot of this interest in the bright colors, but here it's obviously prompted by the entire wealth and opulence of colors, and also the vernacular tradition, the folk tradition of weaving and beading, so all those colors come from there. In this case, when you're talking about colors like this created in Germany, it's based on this different agenda, so to speak. And yes, he dies a few months into World War I. And in a letter that he sent to his wife from the front, he described the war as the most horrific thing a human being could ever experience. So his final painting was Farewell. So he was, this is the painting, 1914. And Franz Marc, his fellow German artist, who also will die 2 years later, said after he learned about Mack, out of all of us, he gave color its brightest and purest sound, as clear and bright as was his entire being, in his obituary. So for them, color was this incredibly expressive tool for conveying emotions, but oftentimes they will purposefully use the term music with color and sound, and that, of course, is mostly associated with Kandinsky, and an essay that he writes on the spiritual in art, where he creates this whole parallel between sounds and colors, and how our whole being or our heart is like this piano with keyboard, and then from this supernatural realm we receive this kind of stimuli, and then we emit all these sounds that become colors in painting. Fascinating stuff, but they were all very interested in how do we go to that beyond the physical. So this is the Farewell, the most melancholic of Mack's paintings, right before he went to the war. And this leads me to Franz Marc, his friend, who wrote the obituary. So he was born in 1880, died in 1916. And he began by studying theology and philosophy. So once again, many of these artists were not just painting because they wanted to express themselves. What's really interesting, no matter how wrong-headed they may have been or complicated, what's very fascinating about the artists around the World War I period, and here I would include even people who were not affected by it, but people like Kandinsky, people like František Kupka, a Czech artist who was one of the first abstract painters, even Picasso. What they were aiming for is to create art that will transform us spiritually. All those colors and abstractions and lines were intended to have a deeper effect upon us and make us see the world in a new way. So he actually, I mentioned that he was initially interested in theology and philosophy because he wanted to create spiritual art. And he used this theme of animals that becomes the leitmotif in his work as symbols of spiritual renewal. And then, yes, he too met Kandinsky in 1910. They actually were the organizers of the first exhibition, Blaureiter, and co-edited that journal that they published. He volunteered, and of course, he had initially enthusiasm for the war, and then he was killed at age 36. And surprise, surprise, he had been decorated for his war effort, but then he was condemned as degenerate by the Nazis, and they removed 130 of his works from public collections. So these are your German expressionists from World War I, August Macke, Franz Marc. We know what happened to them afterwards when the Nazis came to power. They began removing their paintings, and in some cases, literally burning and destroying their paintings because they were all of a sudden deemed degenerate artists. Why were they degenerate? Because they painted in this anti-naturalist fashion with these crude reds and blues and yellows. They were not realistic and beautiful enough. So there was this major, the degenerate art exhibition in Germany in the 30s, when actually people lined around the block of the building in order to enter and see the paintings, because they knew that these paintings were not going to be seen ever again. So these are the kinds of degenerate works that Franz Marc created. This is from that period of the Blaureiter, the Blue Horseman. Animals contain the distillation of the spiritual for him. Animals have that kind of purity that humans have lost because of civilization. Animals are instinctual, animals are honest. And the horse is, of course, always the heroic symbol par excellence in our civilization. So horses are very important to him. And here he says, art is nothing but the expression of our dream. The more we surrender to it, the closer we get to the inner truth of things, our dream life, the true life that scorns questions and doesn't see them. So they're not interested necessarily in giving you a rational explanation of anything. Quite the contrary, I mentioned Freud earlier. They're interested in the subconscious, in the supernatural, in the mystical, in something dreamlike, something that's not accessible to reason. And that's why the colors are so rich, because they're supposed to create this upheaval in you. So you're trying to figure out what's going on in this painting with this blue, red, yellow, green. It's fascinating. This groping in the dark, like how do we create this kind of spiritual painting? And here is another of his paintings, which is called Fate of Animals, from around 1913. And basically, again, a quote from Marc, "Today we are searching for things in nature that are hidden beneath the veil of appearance." In other words, the veil of what is apparent, of the real. We look for and paint the inner spiritual side of nature. And here you have, of course, a kind of struggle of the animals, that kind of essential, elemental fate of nature in collision, where all these forms are in collision with one another, and where forms become ever less discernible, and they become pure abstract shapes of red, green, blue, yellow. And of course, the louder the colors, yellow, red, blue, primaries, the stronger their sound impact, the sound that it impacts our soul. I know this is all very complicated, abstract material, but I'm trying to kind of convey to you what they were after, these people. And here is Deer in the Forest, another highly abstract symbolist painting. And they love primaries. Again and again you will see red, blue, yellow, rather than nuances, rather than realistic light and shadow. Because for them, primaries are the fundamental colors of the color spectrum, and the primaries are the strongest tones in musical terms. They're the strongest tones. And it's kind of overlaying of primaries that creates this tone and countertone and resonance, but the strongest resonance is created through primary colors. And this one, where everything becomes just abstraction. That's how abstract art was born in Europe, through this search for ever more impactful forms, emotional forms. So Expressionism, German Expressionism of the teens, is very closely related to the birth of abstraction. And as it was mentioned earlier, Franz Marc had an entire system of what which color means. And he says here, blue is the male principle, stern and spiritual. Yellow, the female principle, gentle, cheerful, sensual. Red is matter, brutal, heavy, and always the color which must be fought and vanquished by the other two. But then here, of course, it's predominated by this red, the hostile red, the violent red. The blue and the yellow are fighting against that red. So this is all about essential principles of being that are in struggle with one another, rather than decorative painting. It has nothing to do with decoration. Absolutely nothing with decoration. It's all about some kind of idea that he wants to convey on canvas. So that's Mark. And I'm going to conclude with another German artist. I'm sorry I'm running a little late maybe. I won't have too much time for question and answer. A fascinating man, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. He lived until 1938. As you can read here, painter, printmaker, sculptor. He actually began his own group, Die Brücke, together with a couple of other lesser-known German artists. He's the most famous artist of the Brücke, or the bridge. And the bridge, that group, is similar to that Blue Rider group, in a sense that it's like what I mentioned earlier about August Mack saying the bridge that we create between what is incomprehensible and comprehensible. The Brücke group is also interested in connecting the spiritual with the material. And this is what he says here, for example, in 1906, for the first exhibition of Brücke. With faith in progress and in a new generation of creators and spectators, we call together all youth. As youth, we carry the future. We want to create for ourselves freedom of life and of movement against the long-established older forces. We've heard this before. Everyone who reproduces that which drives him to creation with directness and authenticity belongs to us. The futurists had something similar. You realize that in a day and age when people were far less connected than today, without internet, without mass communication as we know it, artists in Europe had very effective ways of recognizing what's happening in Italy, in France, in Germany. It's fascinating how cosmopolitan that whole scene was, and how everybody, by different means, they want to come to the same end, the new. Get away from the old. Get away from the academic. Find a new kind of art that responds to the new world. All of them are searching for the same. And they, of course, come up with different expressions of that search. And you will see, briefly, how Kirchner searched for his new. So, in the manifesto, and everybody, of course, creates a little group, and everybody has a manifesto. And they all think they're the most avant-garde of all. So Kirchner says, anyone who directly and honestly reproduces the force which impels him to create belongs to us. That's a key term, because the idea is that we don't want to be fine. We don't want to be delicate. Quite the contrary. We want to go to the essence and then find a way to express that essence. And therefore, once again, this crude color palette with primaries, with clashing colors that create these clashing tones in musical terms. And this is, for example, one of the many paintings he created of Nollendorf Platz in Berlin in 1913. Here is another one, ugly, right? I mean, this is not a beautiful picture. It's self-consciously, again, the term is primitivist. Primitivist aesthetic, like Picasso with the African masks. They're trying to go beyond what is called European. And they try to talk about painting as created by children. And being like child becomes very important to them because children are not spoiled by learning. Children paint intuitively and instinctively with bright colors. They don't care about beautiful forms the way adults do. So they want to create these sort of ugly pictures. No wonder Hitler called them degenerate, right? You can understand the Nazis with their sort of heroic imagery, what they thought about these pictures. And this is another one, portrait of Franzi in an embroidered chair. And here is another, a child's head from 1906. And by the way, this I found through a website from the art market. And it's fascinating that, of course, a lot of these paintings now are extremely, extremely valuable. Here you have an example. This was sold. It's just a little oil on cardboard. And it was sold in 2010 for close to $2 million. So yeah, he's a major, major artist in history of art today. What happened to him? In 1915, he became a driver for an artillery regiment, suffered a mental and physical breakdown, was discharged as unfit for military service, ended up in various sanatoriums, then lived in Switzerland, and he continued painting until 1938. And in 1937, during the Degenerate Art Show, the Nazis removed 639 paintings from public collections, and he committed suicide, couldn't see another war coming. In 1938, he committed suicide. So that was the end of this particular German artist. And should I go into Egon Schiele? Just very, very briefly, he may be the best known, just in a couple of minutes. He had studied with Gustav Klimt. He was also drafted in the Austrian army in 1915, but fortunately he had a desk job because he was already a painter. So he was sort of, he could draw and paint, he didn't really fight, and he became quite well known and notorious in Vienna even before the war, but he had a big exhibition in March of 1918. 7 months later, he also became victim of the influenza pandemic. 3 days after his pregnant wife died from the same. Schiele is a complicated artist. It's really unfair to deal with him in 3 minutes, but just to try to sum up what makes Schiele so interesting as an artist during this time is that really he comes from this very dynamic milieu, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Vienna before World War I. And in Vienna there is this whole secessionismus or secession movement, this kind of their own version of avant-garde or new art, which they want to create, as exemplified by the much more beautiful Gustav Klimt with all of those gold background paintings. Well, but Austrians also developed this very expressionist direction in art. Oskar Kokoschka will become also associated with the secessionists. But Schiele, this tragic young man, is one of the first and boldest of the Vienna Expressionists. This self-portrait says it all. It shows you a person in anguish, a person who is expressing some kind of existential anxiety. He seems to be obsessed with this notion of doubleness. Again, Freud, Vienna, right? 1915. This whole idea that we are not a single person, we are a person and a counter-person. And he says here that he is interested in representing these complex processes within his own psyche. Paints this double portrait. There is another self-portrait from 1914. And then, of course, he was notorious for creating inappropriate pictures in which he highlighted human sexuality, but also this whole idea, it's not about love and eroticism, it's also about struggle. And it's about human beings reduced to sort of pure instinct. And here you have this